Something went wrong inside Microsoft's most ambitious operating system release in a decade. Wrong in the specific way that the most consequential corporate disasters go wrong, not through the dramatic failure whose occurrence is immediately visible in the system crash, the security breach, or the product defect whose manifestation produces the immediate user harm, whose documentation creates the accountability, whose assignment the visible failure enables, but through the slow, accumulating, survey-measurable, migration-evidenced form. Documented wrong of a product, whose design philosophy made assumptions about what the users who would receive it wanted, needed, and would accept that the user's actual response has been systematically disproving across the years since the release, whose confident launch Microsoft conducted without the specific awareness that the response whose accumulation has been constituting the disaster that the confident launch did not anticipate was the response that the design philosophy whose implementation the launch delivered was going to produce from the user population, whose relationship with their operating system the design philosophy had fundamentally mischaracterized. The Windows 11 disaster that Microsoft did not see coming is not the disaster of a failed product, whose market rejection the sales figures document in the terms that the business press covers. When the product failure is the product failure of a consumer electronics device or a subscription service whose adoption numbers the quarterly earnings report makes publicly visible, Windows 11's adoption numbers are not the disaster's documentation, because the adoption numbers whose measurement reflects the OEM installation on new hardware, rather than the user's deliberate upgrade. Choice from Windows 10 cannot distinguish the user who chose Windows 11 from the user who received Windows 11 with the hardware, whose purchase was motivated by the hardware rather than by the operating system, whose installation the hardware purchase delivered. The disaster's documentation is in the different data, the data that measures not whether users received Windows 11, but whether users whose receipt of Windows 11 wanted what they received. And that documentation is the documentation of the user satisfaction measurements, the Windows 10 extended support demand, the Linux migration statistics, and the community forum discussions whose aggregate tells the story that the OEM installation numbers obscure. The disaster has three distinct components whose individual examination precedes the combined picture whose assembly from the individual components produces the full scope of what Microsoft did not see coming. The first component is the hardware exclusion disaster, whose scope Microsoft's pre-launch hardware requirement analysis substantially underestimated. The TPM 2.0 requirement, the secure boot requirement, and the processor compatibility list, whose exclusion of processors released as recently as 2017 created the specific situation that Microsoft's pre-launch analysis had assessed as affecting a manageable proportion of the installed Windows base, but whose actual scope, the post-launch measurement of the excluded hardware population revealed, was substantially larger than the pre-launch assessment had produced as the estimate whose confidence Microsoft's launch planning reflected. The scale of the hardware exclusion created the specific user experience whose character Microsoft's pre-launch planning had not fully modeled, which is the experience of the user who attempts the Windows 11 upgrade, receives the incompatibility notification, and is presented with the choice between purchasing new hardware that meets the Windows 11 requirements and remaining on Windows 10, whose support Microsoft's end-of-life announcement has scheduled for October 2025. This choice, whose presentation to the user Microsoft had anticipated as the motivation for the hardware refresh cycle, whose commercial benefit, the Windows 11 launch, was partly designed to produced in many of those users a different response than the hardware refresh that the binary framing of the choice implied as the only alternative to the Windows 10 end-of-life exposure, which was the investigation. Of alternatives, whose existence the hardware exclusion's frustration motivated the investigation of, and whose discovery the investigation produced as the Linux migration pathway. The continued Windows 10 use, whose extended support Microsoft subsequently offered under commercial pressure, and the macOS consideration, whose investigation the hardware purchase requirements trigger enabled for users whose computing requirements were not Windows-specific, in ways that made the macOS alternatives evaluation rational when a hardware purchase was required regardless. The hardware exclusion's disaster character is not the disaster of the requirement itself, whose security rationale, the TPM 2.0 and secure boot requirements reflect in the terms that the security research community's analysis of the security improvements the requirements enable has validated as genuinely improving the platform's security posture. The disaster is the implementation whose combination of the technically justified requirement with the processing cutoff list, whose conservatism excluded hardware, whose security capabilities were functionally equivalent to the included hardware for the specific security requirements the cutoff was designed to ensure, and whose exclusion served the hardware refresh motivation's commercial interest alongside the security requirements' technical interest, producing the user experience of the commercially Motivated exclusion, whose security justification was the justification whose invocation was accurate but insufficient to characterize the complete motivation, whose commercial component the security framing obscured rather than disclosed. The second component is the interface design disaster, whose character is the character of the design decision that serves the designer's vision at the cost of the user's workflow, compounded by the specific circumstance that the users whose workflow the design decision costs are the users whose prior experience with the prior interface, whose replacement the design decision implements, has calibrated their workflow expectations and their muscle memory to the interface whose replacement the design decision is implementing without asking whether the replacement improves the workflow or replaces the workflow with something the designer prefers, regardless of whether the user's workflow prefers it. The centered taskbar, whose implementation in Windows 11 replaced the left-aligned taskbar, whose position every version of Windows since Windows 95 had established as the organizational constant around which the Windows user's spatial memory had been built across the decades of that constant's maintenance, is the design decision whose specific character makes it the representative example of the interface design disaster's component whose examination produces the clearest illustration of the design philosophy's mischaracterization of the user relationship. The centered taskbar is not wrong in the aesthetic sense that the designer who made the centering decision was making an aesthetically indefensible choice. The centered taskbar is demonstrably more visually balanced than the left-aligned taskbar in the terms that the visual design's principles of compositional balance describe as the improvement the centering produces. The centered taskbar is wrong in the workflow. Sense that the spatial memory whose years of development around the left-aligned start button's position in the screen's lower left corner had made the start button's activation the gesture whose automaticity required no conscious attention. For the Windows user, whose hand movement to the screen's lower left was the movement that the spatial memory, rather than the conscious attention, was producing, and whose disruption by the centering required the recalibration of the spatial memory that the centering imposed on every Windows user simultaneously through the update that delivered the centered taskbar to the installed base without providing the centering's rationale in the terms that the spatial memory recalibration's cost would require to constitute the justification that the cost demands. The Start menu's redesign, whose removal of the live tiles that Windows 10 had maintained as the dynamic information display that the customization-oriented user had invested in, configuring, and whose replacement with the pinned applications grid that provides less information density, less customization depth, and less workflow-specific organization than the live tiles whose replacement it represents, was simultaneously the design decision that removed the most distinctively Windows feature from the Windows interface in the service of the simplified aesthetic, whose implementation the designer's vision required regardless of the workflow cost, whose imposition on the users who had been using the live tiles' information density and customization depth the removal constituted. The Interface Design Disasters community documentation is the documentation of the Microsoft community forums, the Reddit Windows communities, and the technology. Publication, comment sections, whose collective volume of the interface complaint provides the evidence that the design decisions whose imposition without meaningful user input produced the user experience, whose negative reception, the third component is the commercial surveillance disaster, whose specific character this channel's documentation has established as the most comprehensively evidenced and the most consequentially impactful component of the Windows 11 disaster, because it is the component whose consequences for the user's relationship with Microsoft extend beyond the Windows 11 experience, into the user's fundamental assessment of whether Microsoft's interests and the user's interests are aligned in the way that the operating system vendor's relationship with the user, whose computing environment the operating system controls, requires for the trust that the relationship demands to be the trust that the relationship actually receives, rather than the trust that the relationship's promotional framing requests. The commercial surveillance disaster's character is the character of the systematic expansion of the data collection, the telemetry transmission, the behavioral monitoring, the AI analysis, and the advertising infrastructure whose deployment through the Windows 11 update infrastructure has been documented across this channel's examination series in the terms that the technical evidence, rather than the advocacy framing supports. The disaster is not the existence of the data collection whose presence in a commercial operating system, whose vendor's commercial model includes advertising revenue and AI development, whose training data requirement the data collection serves, is the existence that the commercial model's honesty requires acknowledging as the commercial interest whose service the data collection provides. The disaster is the gap between the data collection's scope and the disclosure's clarity, The gap, whose measurement is the measurement of how much the Windows 11 user who has not specifically investigated the data collection infrastructure knows about what Windows 11 is doing with their data compared to what Windows 11 is actually doing with their data, and whose magnitude the examination, whose conduct requires the specific investigation that most users have not conducted, reveals as the gap that the disaster's commercial surveillance component represents. The disaster's commercial surveillance component's most consequential expression is the recall feature, whose deployment and redeployment, whose documentation this channel has provided, establishes as the representative expression of the philosophical orientation, whose consistent direction the Windows 11 update series has been following. Because recalls continuous screen recording, whose implementation as a default enabled feature and whose redeployment after the community opposition that produced the announced disabling demonstrates the organizational commitment to the surveillance infrastructure's deployment that the community opposition's insufficient deterrence reveals is the commitment whose direction the disaster's commercial surveillance component is following, regardless of the community opposition whose insufficiency as the deterrent the redeployment confirms. Microsoft did not see the disaster coming, because the organizational perspective from which the Windows 11 design was conducted was the perspective of the organization whose commercial interests the design served alongside the user's interests in the proportions that the commercial interests' priority in the design decisions, whose combined implementation constitutes the Windows 11 experience, reveals as the proportions in which the user's interests were subordinated to the commercial interests, rather than served alongside them in the equal partnership, whose promotional framing implies the relationship's character. The disaster's visibility requires the user's perspective, whose adoption, the organizational perspective's dominance in the design process, prevented from producing the warning signals whose presence before the launch might have modified the design decisions, whose post-launch reception has been constituting the disaster that the pre-launch organizational perspective did not see coming. Because the user perspective, whose adoption would have produced the seeing, was the perspective that the organizational perspective's dominance displaced from the design process's conduct. The Windows 11 disaster is not the disaster of the product that failed commercially in the terms that the business press uses to characterize the product failure. It is the disaster of the operating system that succeeded commercially in the terms of the OEM installation numbers, while failing in the terms of the user satisfaction, the user trust, and the user loyalty, whose maintenance the commercial success's sustainability requires, but whose erosion the design philosophy's implementation has been producing alongside the installation numbers whose growth the OEM distribution model ensures, regardless of whether the installed users would have chosen the product if the choice had been genuinely theirs. The disaster's resolution requires the organizational perspective's modification to incorporate the user's perspective, whose adoption before the design decision rather than after the community forum complaint, whose accumulation documents the decision's reception would produce the decisions, whose reception would not constitute the disaster, whose accumulation the current Windows 11 experience represents, for the users whose relationship with their operating system has been defined by the decisions they did not make and the surveillance they did not authorize, and the interface changes whose imposition they did not request. Microsoft did not see the disaster coming. The users did not see it coming either, until they were living in it and reading the forum posts and examining the privacy settings and beginning the research whose conclusion was the Linux distribution download by the users who are seeing it clearly enough to act on it, in the numbers that the OEM installation statistics do not capture and that the user satisfaction surveys are beginning to document in the terms that the disaster's character requires measuring to be fully visible. The seeing of it is the beginning of the response whose character will determine whether the disaster's continuation produces the correction that the seeing enables or the continuation that the not seeing enabled.